never thought I would be the one telling this story. Not after everything I had seen. Not after all the years I spent standing on the edge between life and death, holding other people's last moments in my hand like something fragile, something sacred, something I believed I understood. But I didn't, not even close. For years I worked in critical care, in rooms where time collapses into seconds, where decisions are made faster than thoughts can form, where machines breathe for you, and silence is never truly silent because there's always a monitor, always a pulse, always something reminding you that life is still there until it isn't. I was trained to be rational, precise, grounded in science. I believed in protocols, in numbers, in what could be measured and explained. And if you had asked me back then about the soul, about consciousness beyond the body, I would have given you a polite, professional answer and moved on. Because in my world, survival was physical and death was final. Or at least that's what I told myself. There was one patient I could never forget, long before anything happened to me. A man who came in after a sudden cardiac arrest. No warning, no history that could explain it. Just one moment alive, and the next moment gone, at least clinically. And I remember standing there as the team worked on him. The controlled chaos, the voices calling out numbers, the pressure of hand compressing his chest, the sound of the defibrillator charging, and in that moment everything felt familiar, routine. Something I had done 100 times before, but something about that case stayed with me. We brought him back against odds that didn't make sense. And days later, when he could speak, he looked at me in a way I couldn't quite understand, like he knew something about me that I didn't. And he said, quietly, "You were the one. I saw you." And I remember the discomfort that ran through me because I hadn't said anything to him. I hadn't even been the one leading the procedure, and yet he described details he shouldn't have known. Things that happened while he had no measurable brain activity. Things that no one had told him. And I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always is. There always has to be. But that moment planted something inside me. Something small and persistent, like a question that refused to be answered. And over the years, I encountered more stories, more patients who spoke about experiences they had while they were technically gone. Stories of light, of movement, of awareness beyond the body. And I listened, always professionally, always with a neutral face. But inside, I kept trying to fit it into something logical, something explainable, something that wouldn't break the structure of everything I believed. And then, years later, it was my turn. It started like any other day, which is something people always say, but it's true in a way that feels almost cruel, because nothing about that day felt special or different. I woke up, I moved through my routine. I had plans, responsibilities, things I thought mattered, and there was no warning, no sign that my life was about to split into a before and an after. I remember a sudden pressure, a strange heaviness in my chest, not pain exactly, more like something was shutting down from the inside. And for a brief moment, I thought I could control it, that I could push through it. But then everything shifted, rapidly, violently, like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep within me. The last thing I remember clearly from the physical world was the sensation of losing control, not just over my body, but over reality itself, like the ground I had always stood on was no longer there. And then silence, but not the kind of silence I knew, not the absence of sound, but something deeper, something complete, something that felt like stepping outside of everything I had ever experienced. I became aware before I understood what awareness meant. And that is the hardest part to explain, because there was no transition, no gradual shift, just a sudden realization that I was still there, but not in the way I had always been. I wasn't inside my body, I wasn't limited by it, and yet I was more present, more conscious than I had ever felt before. There was no pain, no fear in the way we understand fear, only a kind of clarity that felt almost overwhelming, like seeing everything at once without needing to focus. At some point, though time didn't exist in the way it does here, I became aware of a darkness, but it wasn't empty or threatening. It wasn't the kind of darkness that hides things. It was more like a space, a vast, infinite openness, where there was no boundary, no edge, no sense of direction. And for a moment I thought, this is it, I'm dead. But the thought didn't carry panic, it carried recognition, like something I had always known, but never remembered until that moment. Then something changed. It didn't appear in front of me the way objects appear in the physical world. It was more like it emerged from within the space itself. A presence, a light, but not light as we understand it. Not something that shines or casts shadows. It was alive, intelligent, aware, yes. And the moment I became aware of it, I felt something I struggle even now to put into words, because love is too small a word, too limited. This was something absolute, something that didn't ask anything from me, didn't judge me, didn't require me to be anything other than what I was. And in that presence, I understood things without being told. I saw my life not as a sequence of events, but as something whole, something interconnected. Every moment, every choice, every impact I had on others, not just what I did, but how it felt to them. And that was the part that broke me open in a way nothing ever had, because I didn't just remember my life, I experienced it from every perspective at once. The kindness I gave, the harm I caused, the moments I thought were insignificant but weren't. All of it, without distortion, without justification. There was no judgment from that presence, only understanding, but somehow that made everything more intense, because I couldn't hide from myself. I couldn't explain things away. I could only see. And in that seeing, there was a kind of truth that felt both painful and liberating, like being stripped of everything unnecessary until only what is real remains. At some point, I became aware of something else, something pulling, something distant, like an echo from another place. And I understood, without being told, that I had a choice, or maybe not a choice in the way we think of choices, but a direction, a continuation. And I knew that if I stayed, I wouldn't return. And if I returned, everything would be different. Not because the world would change, but because I would. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything collapsed back into something dense, heavy, limited. And then I felt my body again, the weight of it, the pain, the noise, the chaos, voices, hands, machines, the sharp contrast between where I had been and where I was now. And I remember thinking, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet certainty, I don't belong here anymore when I'm back. Recovery was not the miracle people think it is. It was slow, difficult, confusing, because I wasn't the same person who had lived that life before, and yet I had to continue living it, and that created a tension I wasn't prepared for. Because how do you return to a world that suddenly feels smaller, louder, more chaotic after experiencing something so vast, so complete? People ask me what happened. Doctors explained it in clinical terms. Oxygen deprivation, neurological responses, brain chemistry, and I understood all of it. I've been on that side of the explanation myself. But none of it touched what I had actually experienced. None of it explained the clarity, the awareness, the details that shouldn't exist if consciousness is only produced by the brain. And the hardest part was this. I couldn't go back to believing what I believed before, but I also couldn't fully explain what I now knew, and that left me in a space between worlds, between understanding and language, between science and something beyond it. But one thing remains, something that has never left me since that moment, something simple and yet more powerful than anything I had ever learned before. Whatever we are, whatever this life is, it is not the end. And whatever exists beyond it is not something to fear, because what I felt, it was not emptiness, not darkness, not judgment, but something infinitely vast, infinitely aware, and deeply, undeniably real. And yet knowing that did not make returning easier. If anything, it made everything heavier, sharper, more difficult to ignore, because once you have experienced something that vast, something that complete, the ordinary world doesn't feel ordinary anymore. It feels fragile, almost artificial, like a thin layer stretched over something much deeper, something people sense but rarely allow themselves to see. The first nights after I came back were the hardest. I would lie awake, staring into the darkness of my room, but it wasn't the same darkness I had encountered before. This one felt empty, silent in a way that lacked presence, and I found myself longing for that other place, that space where awareness was full, where I was not confined to a body, where everything made sense without needing an explanation. Here, everything required effort again. Every movement, every thought, every emotion felt dense, slowed down, like trying to move through water. But it wasn't just a physical adjustment. It was what stayed with me. The fragments of that experience that refused to fade. The way certain moments from my life would replay themselves, not as memories, but as something alive, something I could feel from both sides. And I began to understand that what I had seen wasn't just a review. It was a lesson, something I was meant to carry forward, something I couldn't ignore without losing something essential. I went back to work eventually, stepping once again into the environment I had always known. The controlled intensity of the ICU, the sound, the urgency, the constant negotiation between life and death. But everything looked different now, not because the room had changed, but because I had. I watched my colleagues move with a certain focus, the same precision I once had, and I realized how much of what we do is built on the assumption that this is all there is, that survival is the ultimate goal, that death is failure, and I couldn't fully hold onto that belief anymore. There was a moment, weeks after my return, when everything shifted again. We had a patient, a young woman, no more than 25, brought in after a sudden collapse. No clear cause, her body shutting down in ways that didn't make sense. And I remember standing beside her bed, watching the monitors, feeling that familiar tension in the room. But something else was there too. Something subtle, something I wouldn't have noticed before. As the team worked on stabilizing her, there was a point where her heart stopped completely. The line on the monitor flattening into that unmistakable silence. And time seemed to stretch, to hold itself in place. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Something that felt almost like recognition, like I knew exactly where she was. Not physically, but beyond that. In that space, I had experienced myself. And without thinking, without planning it, I spoke, not loudly, nor in a way that anyone else seemed to register. But I said, "You're not alone. You can come back." And I don't know why I said it. I don't know what part of me believed it would matter. But it felt necessary, like something that needed to be said, regardless of whether it made sense. A second later, her heart responded. I could tell myself it was coincidence, that it was the result of everything the team was doing. And maybe it was, maybe all of it was. But something about that moment stayed with me, not as proof, but as possibility, as something that opened the door I could no longer close. Over time, I began to notice more things, small things at first, subtle shifts in perception, moments where I felt something before it happened, where I sensed the presence of something beyond what was visible, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but quietly, persistently, like a background awarenesses that had always been there but had been drowned out by noise. There were patients who would look at me in ways that felt familiar, the same way that man had looked at me years before, as if they recognized something in me that I was only beginning to understand myself. And sometimes just before they passed, there would be a change in the room, something difficult to describe, like the atmosphere itself became softer, more open, less confined, and I would feel that same presence again, faint but unmistakable. But with all of this came something else, something I hadn't expected, doubt. Because no matter what I had experienced, no matter how real it felt, I was still the same person who had been trained to question, to analyze, to look for explanations. And there were days when I would sit with everything I had seen and try to dismantle it piece by piece to find the flaw, the misinterpretation, the neurological explanation that would bring it back into something familiar, something safe. And sometimes I almost succeeded. I would convince myself that it was all a product of the brain under extreme stress, that consciousness can create entire realities in seconds, that memory can distort and reconstruct experiences into something more meaningful than they actually were. And for brief moments, that explanation would feel solid, comforting even, because it returned me to a world where everything could be understood. But then something would happen, something small, something impossible to ignore, and that structure would collapse again. Like the time I was speaking with a patient who had been unconscious for hours, his condition critical, his body barely holding on. And as I stood there checking his vitals, I suddenly felt that same clarity, that same shift in awareness, and without knowing why, I leaned closer and said his name softly, even though he hadn't responded to anything before. And in that moment, his eyes opened just for a second, and he looked directly at me, not confused, not disoriented, but aware, fully aware. And then he was gone. Moments like that accumulated, quietly, persistently, until they formed something I could no longer dismiss. And still, the most difficult part wasn't understanding what had happened to me. It was understanding what to do with it. Because how do you live in a world where you know that death is not what we think it is, but everyone around you still sees it as the end? How do you speak about something that exists beyond language, beyond proof, without sounding like you've lost your grounding in reality? How do you carry that knowing without letting it separate you from the people who haven't experienced it? For a long time, I said nothing. I continued my work. I followed the same routines. I spoke the same language as everyone else. But inside, everything had shifted. And there were moments when the internal difference felt almost unbearable, like I was living two lives at once, one visible, one hidden. Until one night, everything changed again. It was late, the kind of quiet that only exists in the early hours when the world feels suspended. And I had just finished a long shift, exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. And as I sat alone, I felt something I hadn't felt since that day. That same pull, that same expansion of awareness. And for a moment, I thought it was happening again, that I was leaving, that I was crossing that boundary once more. But I wasn't. This time I remained fully present in my body, fully aware of my surroundings, and yet the presence, that light, that intelligence, it was there again, not in front of me, not separate from me, but intertwined with everything, as if the boundary between worlds had thinned just enough for me to perceive it without leaving. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. What I experienced wasn't somewhere else. It wasn't a place you go after you die. It is here. It has always been here. We just don't see it. And the reason we don't see it is not because it is hidden from us, but because we are not looking in the way that allows it to be perceived. That realization didn't come as a thought. It came as a knowing, immediate and undeniable, and with it came a shift, not in the world around me, but in how I existed within it. Like something had aligned, something had opened, something that could never fully close again. And from that moment on, I knew that my life was no longer about returning to what it had been. It was about learning how to live with what I had seen. I wish I could say that from that point forward, everything became peaceful, meaningful, easy to accept. But that would be a lie. And if I'm telling this story at all, I want to tell it without hiding behind beautiful words. The truth is that what happened to me did not make me immediately enlightened. It did not remove fear from my life. It did not turn suffering into poetry. And it certainly did not make the world gentler. What it did was tear something open. And once that opening existed, I could no longer return to the comfortable blindness I had lived in before. I began to feel everything more deeply. Not only the tenderness in people, but their grief, their panic, their loneliness, the quiet despair they carried behind ordinary conversations. It was as if surviving death had left me without the protective skin most people move through life with. I would still function, still work, still smile, still answer questions, complete tasks, and appear composed. But inwardly, I was changing in ways I could not control. I was becoming porous, the thing I had once dismissed. And nowhere was that more overwhelming than in the hospital. There are places in this world where the veil feels thinner. And I believe now that intensive care units are among them because they're full of unfinished goodbyes, suspended lives, prayers whispered by people who no longer know what else to do, and bodies that hover in the strange territory between staying and leaving. Before my own experience, I thought I understood that environment because I worked in it. Afterward, I realized I had only understood its mechanics. I had not understood its spiritual weight. I had not understood how much was happening there that none of our monitors could measure. There was an elderly man admitted after a massive stroke, unresponsive, deeply compromised, the kind of case where families cling to tiny signs because the alternative is too brutal to say aloud. His daughter sat beside him almost every evening, reading to him from a worn paperback Bible. Her voice, calm but frayed at the edges, like the voice of someone holding herself together by sheer discipline. One night, I went in to check his line and adjust his medication, and the room felt immediately different, unusually still, almost luminous in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting. He hadn't moved in hours, yet when I stepped near the bed, I felt a distinct sensation that someone else was present with us. Not in a frightening way, not like an intruder, more like a silent witness. I looked at the daughter, and she was staring at the corner of the room with tears slowly falling down her face. She didn't seem embarrassed, only astonished. She asked me in a whisper if I had felt that, and I should have said no. Should have given her something careful and clinical, but instead I asked, did someone in your family pass recently? Her expression changed instantly. She told me her mother had died 3 months before, and that her father had been calling her name for days before the stroke. We stood in silence for a moment. Two adults in a hospital room saying nothing because language suddenly felt crude. An hour later, he died quietly, without struggle, and the daughter held his hand the entire time with a look on her face that was not pure grief. It was grief mixed with recognition. That look stayed with me. After that, I began keeping a private journal, not because I intended to publish anything or convince anyone, but because I was terrified that if I didn't document what was happening, I would slowly begin to doubt myself again. I wrote down the moments that resisted explanation, the words patients said before dying, the recurring sensation, the dreams that followed shifts, the strained precision of intuition that later proved true. I wrote at night, sometimes for hours, trying to pin something vast and formless onto paper, and over time a pattern emerged. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make this thing dramatic. There were no booming voices from heaven, no glowing apparition in hallways, no cinematic declarations. It was subtler than that, and perhaps because of that, more convincing. The pattern was this. Consciousness seemed to persist in ways I had no training for. Love seemed to remain active even in dying, and the moments surrounding death were often accompanied by a coherence, an intelligence, a kind of order hidden beneath the medical emergency. Even when the body was in chaos, something else was not. Something else remained entirely intact. I told almost no one, not at first. I knew too well how easily stories like mine are dismissed, pathologized, romanticized, or turned into something marketable and shallow. I didn't want to become one of those people who lose all proportion after an extraordinary event. I wanted to remain honest, anchored, responsible. So I kept the experience folded inside me like a secret flame. But secrets do not stay still. They either die from neglect or they demand a life of their own. And mine began pressing harder each month. I found myself sitting with families longer than my schedule allowed, not because I had more information for them, but because I sensed that presence again and again in the threshold moments, and I could not walk away from people who were standing at the edge of something holy, but at least honoring their fear. Sometimes I would simply put a hand on a shoulder and say, talk to them. Hearing may be deeper than we understand. And the number of times families later told me that their loved ones squeezed their hand, shed a tear, changed expression, or stabilized long enough to hear what needed to be said became too many to ignore. Medicine would call many of those events coincidence. Perhaps some were, but not all coincidence is meaningless. Sometimes coincidence is just a name we use for patterns we are not yet humble enough to understand. The hardest case of that year was a teenage boy brought in after a violent accident. He was young enough that his face still held traces of childhood, even beneath the swelling and bruising, and his mother arrived in a state I can only describe as primal devastation. People imagine grief as sobbing, collapsing, screaming, but there's another form of grief that is far more terrifying. Stillness so complete, it feels detached from the body. She was polite, quiet, almost eerily composed, and that frightened me more than hysteria ever could. She stood beside his bed and stared at him as though the world had already ended. Now no one else in the room had realized it yet. He deteriorated through the night. There was bleeding we couldn't stop, instability we couldn't reverse, a downward motion that had become irreversible before he even reached us. I remember walking into the room near dawn and seeing the mother leaning close to his ear, whispering something over and over again. When I approached, she stepped back and asked me if people ever choose not to return. The question landed in me like a stone dropped into deep water. I asked why she was asking, and she said that all night she had felt him drifting farther away, not in the medical sense, but as a mother. She said she could not explain it, except to say that the connection had been stretching, thinning, and now felt almost gone. She asked me if it was selfish to keep asking him to stay when he looked so tired. No textbook prepares you for a question like that. No protocol tells you how to answer them. I should have said something neutral. Instead, I told her the most honest thing I knew. Love lets go when it has to. She closed her eyes, inhaled shakily, then bent over her son and said, "It's all right, baby. If you need to go, you can go." His heart stopped less than 2 minutes later. I was standing at the monitor when it happened. The timing was so immediate it took my breath away. She didn't scream. She kissed his forehead and said, "I felt him leave." I believed her. Not long after that, I began having dreams, unlike normal dreams. These were not random or symbolic in the usual fragmented way. They possessed structure, continuity, and an emotional texture that felt more real than waking life. In one of them, I was walking through a corridor that resembled the ICU, but extended impossibly far, with doors on both sides and a soft golden light breathing beneath each threshold. I knew, without being told, that behind each door was a life at a crossroads. As I walked, I heard voices, not speaking to me exactly, but passing through me, fragments of longing, apology, fear, gratitude. At the end of the corridor stood the man from years earlier, the first patient who had unsettled me by describing what he saw while dead. He did not look younger or healthier or transformed into some idealized version of himself. He looked unmistakably like himself, only entirely free of confusion. free of pain, almost radiant with coherence. He said one sentence, "You'll still think it is somewhere else." Then I woke up with tears all over my face and the strange certainty that I had not dreamt him so much as met him. I tried to rationalize it as memory and subconscious processing, but the emotional precision of it was stronger than memory. It felt like communication stripped of spectacle. By then, the strain of living between these realities was starting to show. Colleagues noticed I had changed, though not all interpreted it kindly. Some thought I had become softer, less efficient. Others thought I was burned out, overly involved, too affected by patients and families. A few were genuinely concerned. One physician I respected deeply asked me after a difficult case if I was all right. And I almost told him everything. I almost told him about the arrest, the void, the presence, the life review, the strange intelligence woven through dying, the way some rooms change before death, the way people sometimes seemed accompanied before anyone flatlined. But I saw in his face the exact point where concern would tip into skepticism, and I stopped myself. I said I was just tired. He nodded in the way professionals nod when they know that is not the real answer, but choose not to press. I went to the supply room afterward and cried so hard I had to hold my own mouth shut to stop the sound. It wasn't only exhaustion, it was loneliness. There is a loneliness in carrying a truth you cannot prove that is harder than ordinary loneliness. It isolates you not because others reject you, but because you know in advance how impossible your inner world would sound to them. Months passed, my body recovered more fully, but internally something else was intensifying. The boundary between ordinary perception and the wider awareness seemed to fluctuate. Some days I felt almost normal, grounded, practical, entirely within the life I had known before. On other days I would be in the middle of something simple, pouring coffee, washing my hand, standing in an elevator, and suddenly feel that same expansion of consciousness pressing just behind my senses, like another dimension leaning close. It never lasted long, never took me fully out of the world, but it was enough to remind me that the world I called reality wasn't self-contained. The first few times it happened, I panicked. I thought I was having neurological episodes, some delayed complication from the arrest. So I underwent evaluation scans, tests, consultations. Everything came back normal, healthy enough, recovering well. No explanation. I should have felt reassured. Instead, I felt strangely stranded because the absence of a medical explanation didn't solve anything. It only left me alone with the mystery again. Then came the winter night I have never spoken about publicly, the night that finally made silence impossible. A storm had been moving across the city all afternoon. Sleet turned into hard rain. Emergency admission claiming everyone tense with fatigue. Near midnight, paramedics brought in a middle-aged woman who had collapsed at home. Cardiac event, prolonged downtime, unstable rhythm, little reason for optimism. We worked her aggressively. Compressions, airway, drugs, shocks. We did everything we were trained to do, and for a while it seemed as though we might bring her back. Then her rhythm deteriorated again, and the attending called time. The room shifted instantly from urgent action to exhausted stillness. Gloves snapped off, shoulders lowered. People began the tiny practical movements that follow death, documenting, clearing, preparing to speak to family. I stood near the foot of the bed and looked at her face, and suddenly an overwhelming force moved through me. Not emotional in the ordinary sense, but energetic, almost electrical. Every hair on my arms lifted. The room became unbearably vivid. I heard one of the monitors still giving off some secondary tone in the background, and layered beneath it I became aware of something impossible. Music. Not literal music from a source in the room, but harmonious vibration. The same kind of impossible resonance I had sensed in my own experience, rich and multidimensional, as though the air itself was singing. I froze. I knew that sound. I knew it with such certainty that fear vanished and something else took its place. Something like awe. At the same moment, the woman's husband was being brought down the hall. I had never met him before. He entered the room already, breaking apart, looked at her once, and collapsed into grief so raw it altered the emotional pressure of the entire space. He kept repeating one thing: she was afraid to die alone. She kept saying she was afraid to die alone. I cannot explain what happened next in a way that will satisfy a skeptic, and perhaps it no longer matters. I moved to his side, held his shoulders, and heard myself say, with a certainty that didn't feel sourced from my own thinking, she is not alone. Tell her yourself. He looked at me as though I were insane. But then he bent over her and started speaking. He told her she had been loved every day of their marriage, even on the days they failed each other, even on the days they were tired, impatient, distracted. He apologized for being late so many times in life. He thanks her for their daughters, for all the ordinary morning they had wasted without understanding their value. The room grew so charged it was difficult to breathe. I felt tears running down my face and had no memory of starting to cry. Then, as he kissed her forehead, the harmonious vibration surged once more and disappeared, gone. The room became ordinary again, heavy, fluorescent, procedural. Later, charting alone, I realized my hands were shaking so badly I could barely write. That night broke me open, not dramatically on the outside. I still drove home, still took off my shoes by the door, still put water on the stove because I had forgotten I already made tea. But inside, something irreversible happened. I could no longer maintain the split between what I knew and what I allowed myself to admit. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn and read through years of journals, case notes I had privately kept, fragments of dreams, names, dates, sensation, phrases uttered by patients before death, accounts from families that matched each other in ways too specific to dismiss. By sunrise, I'd covered the table with papers. It did not look like evidence in the scientific sense. It looked like the wreckage of a mind trying desperately to map a continent no one had taught it existed. And yet beneath the chaos, there was unmistakable coherence. A single thread ran through everything. Consciousness does not end where the body ends. Love is not sentimental decoration, but an organizing force. And dying, while physically brutal, is often accompanied by a reality far more ordered and merciful than we imagine from this side. I took a leave not long afterward. Officially, it was for recovery, accumulated stress, emotional exhaustion. All of that was true, but it wasn't the deepest truth. The deepest truth was that I needed to find out whether what I had experienced could be lived with honestly, whether there was a way to remain sane, intellectually responsible, spiritually awake, and human all at once. I traveled very little, spoke to almost no one, and spent long hours walking in places where the world felt less crowded by noise. Forest trails, winter beaches, empty churches during weekdays, public garden just before closing. It was in those places, away from machinery and crisis and clinical expectation, that I began to understand a second layer of what had happened to me. My near-death experience had not been given to me so I could become certain about the afterlife in some simplistic, doctrinal sense. It had been given to destroy my arrogance, to show me how tiny my certainties had been, to teach me that knowing is not the same as controlling, and that reverence is sometimes a more truthful response to mystery than explanation. During that leave, I met a woman at a small retreat center by accident or by design, depending on what language you are willing to use. She was older, composed, not theatrical, with a kind of presence that settles a room rather than demand attention from it. We ended up speaking after a lecture on grief, and within 10 minutes, I felt the dangerous temptation to tell her everything. Usually, that impulse frightened me. But with her, it felt less like exposure and more like recognition. So I told her, not all at once, but enough. The arrest, the void, the light, the life review, the changes since returning, the patterns around dying, the vibrations, the way ordinary reality sometimes felt, thin and provisional now. She listened without interrupting, without widening her eyes at the spiritual parts, without rushing to affirm or interpret. When I finished, she said something that rearranged me. She said, "The mistake is thinking the experience was extraordinary because it is rare. It is extraordinary because most people forget." I stared at her. She said that many traditions, stripped of dogma and fear, point toward the same truth. Consciousness is fundamental, embodiment is temporary, and love is not merely an emotion, but a property of reality itself. She did not ask me to adopt any system. She only warned me that after such an opening, the temptation is either inflation or denial. Either you become grandiose and think you have been chosen to possess cosmic secrets, or you shrink back into ordinary skepticism and amputate the deepest part of yourself. Your task, she said, is neither. Your task is to become trustworthy to what you saw. I wrote that sentence down the moment I got back to my room. It remains one of the most important instruction I have ever received. When I eventually returned to work, I did so differently, not recklessly, not with an urge to preach, not with any intention of imposing my experience on vulnerable people. If anything, I became more careful, more restrained. But internally, I had made a promise. Whenever I could serve truthfully in the threshold moments of another person's life, I would. That sometimes meant saying very little. Sometimes it meant urging a family member to speak words they were afraid to say. Sometimes it meant reminding staff to treat unconscious patients as though they could hear every word, because perhaps they can in ways we do not understand. Sometimes it meant standing silently in a room after death and acknowledging inwardly that something immeasurable had occurred. I stopped participating in the casual roughness that medicine sometimes develops as self-protection. No more speaking over bodies as if the person were absent. No more letting efficiency erase dignity. Once you have been on the other side of the bed, you do not forget. And yet the deepest test was still ahead of me. It came nearly 2 years after my arrest, at a point when I had become almost functional again in the visible sense, though inwardly I remained changed. I was driving home after an extended shift, exhausted, mind-dulled by repetition and fluorescent fatigue. It was raining, traffic blurred, the city all reflected lights and dark pavement. At an intersection just a few miles from home, a truck ran a red light. I saw it too late. There was the impossible slowness that sometimes enters before impact. The instant when time seemed to widen instead of contract. And in that widening, I felt something terrifyingly familiar. The beginning of separation. Metal struck metal. Glass burst. Sound twisted. My body lurched violently. Then everything dropped out from under me. For one suspended instant, I was both in the crash and beyond it. I saw the interior of the car, the air filled with glittering shards, my own hands no longer fully obeying me, and layered to that, like another frequency opening, was that same vastness, patient and unmistakable. I cannot say I fully left this time. It was more like the door opened and I recognized it immediately. No black void first, no confusion, only recognition. And with recognition came a question, not in words, but absolute in meaning. Are you ready? I wish I could tell you that I answered nobly, but the truth is more human. My first response was grief, not fear of pain, not fear of punishment, grief at the thought of leaving people unfinished, of leaving love in mid-sentence, of leaving service incomplete. I thought of the families whose eyes I had met in the worst moments of their lives, or the patients who still needed someone not to treat their dying as a mechanical failure, or the work I had not yet done to become worthy of what I had been shown. And then another understanding came just as clearly. If I returned again, I could no longer waste the life I had left on hesitation. When emergency responders reached me, I was semi-conscious, bloodied, confused, alive. The injuries were significant, but not catastrophic. Another miracle, people said later, another lucky escape. I nodded because I had no appetite by then for arguing with the language people need in order to bear what they cannot explain. But privately, I knew the second accident had not merely spared me. It had clarified me. It had shown me that my longing for the other side, however understandable, could become its own form of seduction. Yes, what exists beyond bodily death is real. Yes, it is more beautiful and intelligent than our fear allows. But no, that does not mean life here is an interruption to be endured. Life here is the work. This density, this confusion, this grief, this limitation, this unfinishedness, this constant need to choose love under pressure and uncertainty instead of in some purified spiritual state. This is the work. The point is not to escape the world because another realm exists. The point is to reveal that realm here through how we live, how we die, how we hold one another in the crossing. That understanding changed everything more than the near-death experience itself had changed it. Before, I had returned carrying knowledge. After the crash, I returned carrying responsibility. There's a difference. Knowledge can make you strange, isolated. In what? Responsibility forces embodiment. It asks something practical of you. It asks whether what you claim to know alters the way others experience your presence. Are you kinder, more honest, less vain, less cruel in subtle ways, more willing to sit in helplessness without trying to dominate it, more willing to forgive, more willing to speak truth gently, more willing to stop pretending that love is weak because it cannot be quantified? Those became the real questions. Not what color was the light, not whether time existed there, not whether consciousness had shape, Those questions matter, but they're not the final ones. The final question is always, what now? So I began to speak carefully at first, in small rooms with grieving families, with nurses who had their own unexplainable stories I buried in under years of professional armor, medical students who still had enough humility to admit the dying might not fit neatly inside a chart. Never demanded belief, we still do not. Belief is cheap when detached from transformation. I simply told the truth as accurately as I could bear to tell it. I said that I had been clinically gone in every way that I had ever been. I said that consciousness felt primary, not derivative. I said that love was not metaphorical there. I said that many dying people said yes, maybe in the middle. I said that the soul that was renewed, call it consciousness, essence, identity, irreducible ceremony is not annihilated, some listen with tears, some with suspicion, some with belief, so intense that it becomes multiples of the story for many. The strangest part is this: the more I spoke about the divine experience, the less I felt I was to dominate. I fell not because I stopped believing, but because I gave my voice fully. I gave it to layers and pieces, to family, to community, to cousins, to midwife people through fear, to restore dignity to dying, to remind the living that most of what we worship as urgent will vanish, and most of what we neglect as soft or ordinary will return. The cold walk ended with tenderness, the apology finally spoken, the hand not withdrawn from the dying. The moment of forgiveness offered when pride says, hold it back. The choice not to humiliate, not to dominate, not to disappear inside indifference. These are not small things. From the perspective I touch, they are astonishingly large. Even now, years later, I still do not fully understand what happened to me. Anyone who speaks with total certainty about this thing is me. Mystery has edges we should not want, just to fit properly. In our way spirits, when others reign, when others become firm, not by ideology, but holds a thresholds, by nothing, despite committed violence, to say, will you not let go again? And one day I will, but not yet. Avoid meaninglessness. Will be at reality, even detached. Reality closer to death. Bishop, Antoinette, peace, love. Until the earth continues her race, I'm here for a reason. The reason is that it really too important. It is to become human enough with some of heaven full in my presence. Listen, if you ask me how I feel afterwards, after your rest, and you tell me because of what you said, something inside something instructional, because it has to be. To remember everything I did, because it has to be. Because it will be. If you ask me what life is, I would say this with even greater conviction. Life is a sacred, difficult opportunity to learn how to love before the crossing comes. Because when almost everything else falls away, when status, the article, the possession, and performance can no longer be carried with you, love remains strangely intact. It remains as truth. It remains as light. It remains as the only thing that was never truly mortal. That is the confession I resisted for years, not because it is unbelievable, but because once spoken, it changes the one who speaks it. To say it aloud is to accept. is human. But even then, beneath all of it, the knowing remains quiet, steady, indestructible. And when my final hour truly comes, by the end of this program, on the roadside, sleep, and so utterly bored in every moment, no one could predict. I do not think the last thought will be what I accomplished, what I earned, carefully defined in letting convenience is not faithful to love after I was sure all is well. That in the end is the only question that still remains. That is the only question I believe follows us across. And that is why I am telling you this now. Not as doctrine, not as performance, not as a story I wish recorded, but as a witness statement from someone who crossed the threshold, returned a faithfully and said, He is well. Is that not enough? He is gone. 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 His presence, His intelligence, His foresight, His grace, accountability, the wisdom I never understood, the infinity of His mercy, the density of the physical world, the machines, the bed, the smell of antiseptic, and layered within it, like a second reality, unfolding through the first, the other dimension, happening in order of existence. My heart started racing, but not from fear, from recognition. And I reached for his hand without thinking. Are you in pain? I asked, forcing myself in the language of my profession. He shook his head slowly. No, I'm remembering. The word hit me harder than anything else he had said. Remembering, not from somewhere new, not as a mirror, remembering. And suddenly everything I had experienced, everything I had struggled to understand, began that it felt fragmented, inaudible, impossible to articulate. At the end, something amazing, a miracle was about to give. He talked to me about love, and my heart was deflated. Time in my hand became numb, stretched, softened, lost in its sharp edges. He looked past me then, not in confusion, not in authority, but as if focusing on something just beyond the visible. He told me that he said quietly, but I don't think he should, your chest tight. For what? I asked. He looked back at me. For you, everything inside remained steady. For me, and indeed he nodded, his expression calm, sweet, so calm that I wasn't listening. Yes, wisdom is quiet. It is quiet. From my own experience, the type that is rarely understood, yet truly understandings. As close to understanding as close to clarity. The words felt like they bypassed my mind completely and went straight into something deeper. Carry what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He exhaled slowly. The memory of what we are, before we forget again. The monitors began to shift. Subtle changes at first, then more pronounced. The moment was closing. I felt it as clearly as I felt my own departure. The threshold. I leaned closer, instinctively, urgently. Are you afraid? I asked. He looked at me with something that resembled compassion. No, he said, are you? The question echoed inside me, and for the first time since everything began, I answered honestly, no, because in that moment I wasn't. Not of death, not of what comes after, only of wanting. Then he smiled again, soft enough, but we would begin to withdraw. death by chance. You understand?